Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? You hear me? Please excuse my voice. I have a paralyzed vocal cord, so I'm not able to speak with a full voice. But I will speak slowly and clearly. So hopefully my voice won't be an obstacle. I'm very happy to be with you to share just a little bit of wisdom in terms of Dominican leadership in religious life today. So my talk will be divided into 3 sections. First of all, just a look at our world today, because this is the context within which you exercise your leadership. Then a brief reflection on what do we mean by leadership and what do we understand by power and authority. And then the 3rd section, a look at leadership in religious life today. And a consideration of how we as Dominican women are invited to be leaders. Okay? So let's just consider our context. We have to begin with the world in which we live, because we cannot speak about leadership, Dominican leadership, in a vacuum. So we need to start with the world today and see what it has to say to us about the kind of leadership that is needed. And when I speak of leadership, I'm speaking about a capacity that lies within each one of us. So I'm not speaking of leadership as limited to those who hold elected positions. In fact, those who hold elected positions of leadership need the rest of us to assume our own responsibility to be leaders wherever we are. So, I feel it would be a mistake not to mention what we have experienced these past months. Because whether or not we admit it, we are all different as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Life has changed. Some of our congregations are fewer in number because sisters have died from coronavirus. Most congregations are experiencing financial challenges due to the pandemic. Some of you may have lost family members or colleagues in ministry to the virus. Some of you may have had to give up ministries or delay their opening indefinitely. And some of you may still be struggling with the effects of quarantine. And for our elderly sisters, the isolation of quarantine was its own unique suffering. And some of these sisters will probably be dealing with the after effects of this trauma for quite some time. So we've lived through a life-changing event. We've experienced fear, uncertainty, loss. The pandemic has given us a sense of disorientation. Our familiar ways of being have been interrupted. So as a result of the pandemic, we live in a moment in which there is great ambiguity. And the coronavirus is still with us, and it will probably be with us for a good long time. It's forcing us to reevaluate our priorities, to examine what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. It's inviting us to consider new ways of being in a world where the illusion of certainty has been replaced by a permanent state of ambiguity. Everything has changed, and everything will continue to change. So an important question for us moving forward is, how do we exercise leadership in a post-COVID world? So COVID-19 has placed the world in a very precarious situation. Serious global problems have become even more serious. So I'd like to just consider a few of the critical issues in our world today and consider them in light of coronavirus and how already difficult situations have become even worse. So I'd invite you to please consider these realities in your own respective countries. So we're bringing the larger room into the world with us. So if we just consider for a moment the condition of women and girls around the world, and you think of their conditions in the countries in which you live, a majority of people who are illiterate in our world today are women and girls. The majority of those people living in extreme poverty today are women and girls. A majority of small farmers today and a majority of artisanal fisher people are women and girls. And they produce almost 50% of the global food supply. But women and girls experience unequal pay, and perhaps they receive no pay at all. They are not permitted to own property. women and children are those who are most negatively affected by climate change and natural disasters. Women and girls throughout the world lack access to education, to clean water, and to sanitation. Adult women account for 51% of all human trafficking victims. Women and girls together account for 71% of all human trafficking victims. There is a large gap in the opportunities for women to participate in decision-making and formal leadership at all levels of society and in the church. And globally, women and children, especially girls, are bearing the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic. Many women are experiencing increased economic insecurity. Women have taken on much of the additional care work due to the closure of schools and daycare centers during the pandemic. Women and girls are at greater risk of coronavirus because they are working on the front lines. They account for nearly 70% of health and social workers globally. And during the coronavirus pandemic, there has been a marked increase in violence against women and girls. In some countries, the increase has been as high as 40%. The United Nations is calling this the shadow pandemic. Violence against women during COVID-19, the shadow pandemic. Another critical issue in our world today, global inequality. The ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. The gap should be growing smaller, but instead we see it increasing all over the world. And COVID-19 has disproportionately affected people of color and those living in poverty worldwide. Some of the reasons for this: worldwide, people living in poverty have poor access to health care. And when they do have access to health care, the healthcare systems are of very poor quality. For people living in extreme poverty, there is a lack of testing for COVID-19. Many people living in extreme poverty have pre-existing health conditions, such as asthma, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart conditions. So this makes them more vulnerable to COVID-19. And there's great concern about the availability of a vaccine. A vaccine will surely be produced. But the question is, will people living in extreme poverty have the same access to the vaccine as people living in other areas? Another critical issue in our world today, climate change. We all know what climate change is doing in parts of Africa, in parts of Latin America, in parts of the United States, in parts of every continent. Rainfall has been impacted. Temperatures are higher than normal. The incidence of severe storms has increased. The quality of our air has become much worse. And people who live in areas with poor air quality are much more likely to die of COVID-19. Changes in temperatures and rainfall patterns worldwide have made conditions more favorable for the spread of infectious diseases, including malaria, Lyme disease, and COVID-19. The last issue I want to introduce are the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with these. But the Sustainable Development Goals can be considered as a roadmap almost every aspect of human life and planetary well-being. And if countries are able to meet these goals, it will provide a stable and prosperous life for every person and ensure the health of the planet. Just a few of the goals I'll mention: to end poverty, to end hunger, quality education for all, gender equality, clean water and sanitation for all, and action on behalf of climate change. goals are the responsibility of every government. But COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the progress of these goals. And it leaves the well-being of people and the future well-being of the planet in jeopardy. When we consider these sustainable development goals, we can see that they show us that everything is connected. I can't eliminate poverty without working on clean water and sanitation. We can't have gender equality if women and girls do not have access to quality education. So all of these goals are connected. And the pandemic also shows us the same thing. The crisis has shown us how deeply connected we are to one another and to the planet. The challenges we face cannot be dealt with in isolation. We must work together. The challenges we face cannot be dealt with in isolation. We must work together. And that includes the challenges we face within religious life itself. I'm sure that you are all familiar with Laudato Si. Many religious congregations and many Dominican religious congregations have done wonderful work in their respective communities, using Laudato Si as a plan of action. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis offers us some very challenging questions. And I believe that these questions are especially challenging for us as we consider leadership and religious life in today's world. Pope Francis says to us, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us? What is the purpose of our life in this world? What's our purpose? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and of all our good efforts? Is it just for the good of our congregations? Or is something bigger involved? What need does Earth have of us? And he says, we need to see that what is at stake is our own dignity. Very important questions for everybody. But I think they take on an added significance for those of us who are engaged in any kind of leadership position. So let's just pause for a moment of silence. And quietly reflect on the context in which we are invited to live our religious lives, the context within which we are invited to serve as leaders. So let's take a few minutes now for just a brief reflection on leadership, power, and authority. This is a very brief definition of leadership that includes some of what leadership entails, but it certainly doesn't give the full picture. But it just gives us something to think about. The authentic exercise of leadership helps others to realize their potential. It inspires others to work with us to achieve a shared vision for the future. And authentic leadership tries to ensure that people have everything they need in order to achieve the missions of an organization. May I just say, the PowerPoint will be provided for you. So if you're struggling to write things down, be easy. You'll have the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint will be translated into French and Spanish. So authentic leadership helps people to realize their potential, the possibilities that lie deep within us. Leadership helps us to discover what they are. Leadership inspires others to work for a shared vision, and it tries to make sure people have what they need. Leadership is not control. And I think Timothy said that when he spoke on Monday also. Leadership is not control. When Sister Elvira spoke, I think, when was it, on Friday or Saturday, at the beginning of your time together, she reflected on the passage from the Gospel of St. Mark. And Sister Elvira said this in her reflection. She said, the true leader realizes that if the people she is entrusted with are without effective principles, if they are stragglers, if they are like sheep without a shepherd, the first thing the leader does is show compassion for them. And in some way, this experience of compassion empowers people to do things they never thought they could do. So the true leader empowers people. The true leader exercises her own power in such a way that it inspires others. So let's just take a look at power. Power can mean many things. But let's consider power as the capacity of a person or a group to influence the behavior of others. So power rests with persons in their individual capacities. The disciples had the power to provide food for the people, but they didn't realize it until Jesus asked the question. Power is really not hierarchical because it's a capacity that lies within us. Power emerges. It comes forth from us as a result of personal and external factors. So Jesus was an external factor. His words, his encouragement, invited the disciples to look for a solution. And power can be exercised without external permission. Every single one of us at this gathering now, every single one of us possesses power. And we can use that power. We choose how to use it. And please God, the way we choose to use it is for the good of other people. Please notice the little image in the center of people holding pieces to a puzzle. For me, this is a wonderful way to illustrate leadership, because each person has a certain capacity, a certain power. And it's when we bring together our own pieces of wisdom, our own pieces of power, that's the way true leadership develops. So let's just take a look at authority for a moment. Authority is granted by an institution. So the authority of your general council has been granted to them by your congregation. Authority signifies a structural relationship. Authority is power which is formally given. We all have power, but authority signifies power which has been given in a formal way. Authority can be delegated. Which is what your general council has done. This is a meeting of the extended council. So the authority of the council has been delegated in the different parts of the world where your sisters are present. Authority is oftentimes a relationship of superior and subordinate. The traditional image that has been used for authority is a pyramid, which would illustrate authority coming from the top down. But in religious life, the image that is used more often to illustrate authority is a circle. People coming together as equals to share their power, to share their gifts together for the common good. So let's just take a moment of silence and just reflect on what your own experience of leadership has been. Consider what your own capacities are. Consider the power that you have within. How have you been able to exercise your power to influence others? Not to control them, but to influence them. Now, sisters, I'd like to take some time to reflect on leadership, imagining leadership in a global community We know we're a global community. We're a global community on this Zoom gathering. We come from all over the world. So let's talk about imagining leadership in this global community of ours, which is constantly changing, especially since the pandemic. We know that organization, management, financial capability, these are all aspects of leadership. But we also need to focus our attention on something much deeper. As Sister Teresa Maya says in her article, we have a new apostolic call to offer meaning to a suffering world. Our leadership is not just about tasks to be done. We are called upon to offer meaning to a suffering world. Leadership in religious life today must allow time and space for new ideas to emerge. Leadership must create time and space where people can freely share their insights with one another and know that they will be valued. Where people will truly listen to one another deeply as we share how we feel God is calling us as a congregation. These are the conversations that will reveal to us the whispers of God's Spirit. And sisters, these are the kinds of conversations that challenge us to use our imagination. Imagination is so important, but it is not always something we associate with leadership. On Monday, Timothy spoke about leadership as letting go and allowing the Spirit to direct you. He said that there is no greater freedom than allowing the Spirit to guide us. So we must be open. We must be open to and prepared for unexpected directions. And we must be willing to try new things. Isn't that what Dominic did? Isn't that what Catherine did? Dominic founded a new order. Catherine did things that women never did before. And isn't it what Mother Jereen did too? Didn't she try new things? So how can you not do this? If you're faithful to your history, you must try new things. Timothy went on to say that the Spirit makes us active, daring, courageous, but never passive. Active, daring, courageous, never passive. Do these words describe you? If not, what blocks the Spirit within you? This is one of the most important questions you can ask yourself, both personally and as a congregation. What blocks the Spirit within you? So I'd like to refer to the article, the YouTube presentation of Sister Teresa Maya, A Vision for the Future of Religious Life. And I'd like to pick up on 4 points that she invites us to consider. Teresa Maya says to us, we must hold a vision, foster our memory, cultivate our noticing, and dare to lead. Vision. She says the time for words is over. We need a new way of witnessing that will manifest our values and that will be more intelligible and accessible for our time. We have a new apostolic call to offer meaning to a suffering world. Regarding vision, sisters, the first step, we need to see what is. What is our reality? Second step, imagine what could be. Third step, cooperate with the sacred, with the presence of the Spirit coursing through all of creation. And finally, take one small step. See what is. Imagine what could be. Cooperate with the sacred, with God's Spirit present in all things. Take one small step. Memory. Teresa Maya says, to understand the future, we need to take time to remember. Remember, in Spanish, comes from recordis, to run through the heart once more. That's beautiful. To remember, to let our memory run through the heart once more. We need to recordar. And she says memory is the sacrament of the present. She also goes on to say that perhaps now we need to recover the memory of our feminist legacy. I would like to suggest to you that feminism is a perspective. It's a way of looking at reality. It's an appreciation for the equal dignity and value of women and men. Sometimes people have a negative reaction when they hear feminism or feminist. Sometimes they think that people who are feminists are just angry women, angry at men. I would like to suggest to you that that's not accurate. Feminism is a perspective, a mindset that is inclusive. It sees and appreciates the value of all people. And it works so that all people, male and female, have access to equal opportunity. When Teresa Maya spoke of recovering the memory of our feminist legacy, she mentioned St. Catherine of Siena. I think if we want a model of a feminist, Catherine is a great person to use. The former master of the order, Aniceto Fernandez, said in 1970, the year Catherine was proclaimed as a doctor of the church. He said of Catherine that she is the woman into whom the whole soul of Dominic passed. Imagine that. Here is a woman into whom the whole soul of Dominic passed. Catherine dignified all women by acknowledging the power she had within her, acknowledging her power and using it to further the reign of God. And sisters, she didn't ask permission. She just did it. Catherine allowed the Spirit to direct her. She used her imagination, and she was active. She was daring. She was courageous beyond belief. And she was never passive. So if Catherine was the woman into whom the whole soul of Dominic passed, what does that mean? What does that look like? So I think it might be helpful if we take a moment to remember Dominic. Let our memory of Dominic run through our hearts once more and inspire our reflection on leadership. This is Calaruega, Dominic's birthplace. In the upper left-hand corner is Dominic's family home. When he was a child, he would climb to the top of the bell tower, and he looked out on a vast landscape. A landscape that seemed to be endless and filled with possibility. A landscape that was wide open. This must have given him a sense of openness, of expansiveness, and of possibility for the future. We know that later in life, Dominic would imagine something new for the church, an order dedicated to the apostolic preaching. Dominic was free. And if his whole soul passed through Catherine, obviously she was free. So let's just consider Dominic for a moment. He was free enough to allow himself to be directed by the Spirit and touched by the signs of his times in a personally transformative way. Dominic was free to question. He questioned, why can only bishops preach? Why should the apostolic life be so limiting and limited? Why not send the friars out to universities? Why not send them out 2 by 2? he was free to question. And my guess is that his question was frequently, why not? Let's try it. Dominic was free to associate. He associated freely with women. He established the Women First at Pruy in 1206. It's been said that it took a whole family to make Pruy work. Men and women, laity and married couples, women who would become nuns, men who would become priests. From the very beginning, there was a spirit of kinship and relationship. For Dominic, it was never just about an individual. Dominican life is about a common project, a collaborative venture, associating with all people in the order in the pursuit of truth. Dominic was free enough to enter into conversation with those who held opposing viewpoints. For instance, the innkeeper. It's been said that the Dominican order was born of multiple conversations. Dominic listened attentively to people's ideas and used the power within him to influence people. His genius was to be a midwife of a new way of religious life by being open to the ideas and to the intuitions of others. Dominic was free to be flexible. He saw the rule as a guide, but he was not a slave to the rule. He was willing to make exceptions if the rule became too ponderous, too heavy, an obstacle to the apostolate. Dominic was free to disperse his friars. He sent them out 2 by 2. He did not restrict them to staying inside the monastery walls, even though he was criticized for this. His intuition, his imagination, knew that it would be better to disperse them, let them go. He was free to educate. He wanted the friars to be in the universities, so they would have to mingle with, associate with diversity. Dominic was free to be disturbed. He was disturbed by the split between matter and spirit, the great heresy of his time. He was disturbed by the poor quality of preaching. And Dominic was free to persevere. He persevered, he kept going, not having any idea of how things would turn out. But he followed the impulse of the Spirit. And because of this, you and I are here today. And if Catherine is the woman through whom the whole soul of Dominic passed, then Catherine is no less free than Dominic was. But the critical question for us is, are we free? And if not, what blocks the Spirit within us? As followers of Dominic, are we allowing ourselves to be directed by the Spirit and touched by the signs of our times in a personally transformative way? And the element of noticing. Teresa Mayce says we're called to live our moment fully. And we live in a moment of profound transformation. Change is everywhere. Borders are changing. Maps are changing. The world is moving with massive migrations of peoples. She said, movement will describe our times. Leading when everything is moving requires a firm commitment to our inner life with God. It also requires active listening. Like Dominic, he was actively engaged with people who had different opinions. Leading when everything is moving requires empathy. Putting ourselves in another person's position so that we can understand their reality. It also requires strategic thinking skills and creativity, which means we must use our imaginations. Our leadership requires the ability to inspire and to convince others. It requires flexibility. And it requires the ability to deal with ambiguity. Constant movement, constant change. What we're invited to is leadership of the whole, meaning we all have a role to play and a contribution to make. In this kind of leadership, relationships are what matters. Tasks are important, but relationships are what matters most. Life is a web of interconnections. where cooperation and participation are required. Everything is connected. Pope Francis reminds us of that in Laudato Si. Chaos and change are the only route to transformation. And remember, we live in a time of great ambiguity, great chaos, great change, thanks to COVID-19. In terms of acting in our capacity as leaders, it's important for each one of us to remember that when we lead, we have the power to project our shadow or our light. Dominic and Catherine projected their light